gods of light will.
Dragonlance is the D&D franchise that I have failed to cover, and its infamous video game trilogy, the Silverbox games, are the only video games I have ever failed to review. This franchise has always been a gaping hole, not just in my content, but also in the modern gamer's understanding of what D&D is and how it got to be this way. D&D, both in the past and the present, have always had an imbalance. Lots of dungeons, nowhere near as many dragons. The Dragonlance setting, also known as Krynn, was the answer. A world where dragons and their riders, as well as those that fight them, are at the center of the narrative. Dragonlance, much more than the Forgotten Realms, more than Mystara, Dark Sun, Spelljammer, more than any other D&D setting, is the origin point to the tone and stylings of D&D as we know it today. But the influence doesn't stop within D&D itself. Dragonlance is also largely the IP that opened the sluice gates in the 1980s and injected D&D into fantasy literature. And this has remained an extremely important part of the genre. I have avoided covering Dragonlance because it is such a load-bearing work of fantasy. Goddamned everything you see in Western fantasy literature is influenced to a degree by Dragonlance, either by embracing its tropes or by rejecting them. So the question, what makes Dragonlance special, is kind of a bigger question than that. The question is, what makes fantasy itself special? And that's a big task, and it's part of why I've avoided a Dragonlance deep dive, even though I've covered some Dragonlance games on this channel before, like Dragon Strike. As to why I've never covered the Silverbox games based on Dragonlance, they are real bad, you guys, and they are one of the oft-cited examples of the worst D&D video games. And they deserve that reputation, let's be clear. On my very first D&D video game review, I promised that I would review the Silverbox game, Heroes of the Lance, if we hit a certain like target. We, of course, utterly smashed that like target because that video went semi-viral and is actually one of the main reasons that I'm here on your screen today. I tried to review Heroes of the Lance, I really did, but it's the least intuitive, least explained, and most painfully obtuse D&D game by a wide mile. I also didn't have an NES controller, which just made things worse. I was certain that I was missing buttons, but I wasn't. The game controls are just that bad. In the end, I chose to review a different D&D game that was also a contender for the worst D&D game, Descent into Undermountain. And then I called that like target obligation fulfilled. But I still do get an angry comment about Heroes of the Lance once every couple months. Dragonlance and the awful video games they spawned are unfinished goddamn business here. And it's time to finally answer. Why is Dragonlance so special? And why is everything based on Dragonlance so awful? Dragonlance from day one was always a bit of a weird case when it comes to D&D settings, because this is the setting that failed to be a game setting, but instead changed the world as a series of novels. And guys, they tried really hard to get you to play this thing, but nobody plays it, everyone just reads it. Dragonlance is the beloved D&D setting that no one actually plays. Before we go any farther, I gotta let you guys know that this video was brought to you by the patrons, and only the patrons. With the economy so unstable right now, sponsors are getting more and more reluctant to work with individual YouTubers, which puts all of us in the internet creative space like this, in a bit of an unstable position. If you're interested in helping out this channel and making sure that we can stay stable and keep posting through all of the economic woes of the world, then the best way to help out is to consider signing up on Patreon. You're gonna get bonus content up there anytime one of my videos generates it. And you'll also gain access to a monthly Patreon exclusive podcast called the SRD Bags, where I invite on my friends from all across the D&D creative space, and we talk about all the goings-on in tabletop, video games, and sometimes other stuff. Now, listen you guys, my last video on the Record of Lodos War, the Japanese D&D killer, it actually got removed a week or two ago by Kadokawa, which obviously hurts a lot for the channel. So if you can, I would really appreciate it if you're able to help out on Patreon, and also, if you didn't know, that video is still up for free on Patreon. It's actually the better version of the video. I posted it alongside the original YouTube version, but the Patreon version is my cut of the video where I didn't have to gut a bunch of the footage that Kadokawa didn't want me to use. Alright, let's get back to the video. Our tale begins in the late 1970s in a married couple's kitchen. Laura Hickman introduced her husband, Tracy Hickman, to D&D, and the two of them became a fountain of creativity. By 1982, the pair of them had begun writing down their home adventures into books that they sent into TSR, the company that owned D&D at the time. The modules were considered big early innovations in the RPG medium, at a time when Dungeons & Dragons was still quite young. Tracy was invited to come work for TSR, and the two of them made the move from Utah all the way to Wisconsin to work for the company. As the story goes, Laura and Tracy began spitballing the earliest concepts of Dragonlance on the long drive to Wisconsin, a dragon-centric setting, with a narrative focus far beyond what any of the other settings had. When they arrived, though, it would be some time before they could properly set to work on that. Instead, the first major project they did for TSR was to single-handedly create the Ravenloft setting and the most iconic and well-known D&D module of all time. These two are just staggering as a D&D power couple. And by the way, Tracy was the one with the official gig at TSR, but Laura was still getting full credit as the co-author. Look, here's her name on the original Ravenloft module. TSR began looking for a new project to solve D&D's missing dragon problem. Tracy and Laura quickly pounced and presented Dragonlance, a narrative tabletop campaign of 12 modules and a tie-in novel series starring the pre-gen characters of the campaign. Apparently they needed to get a cabal of big TSR names together to bully leadership into making this setting real. Eventually, the bosses decided to just let them do it, since the team seemed energized about this. Now, before Dragonlance could become more than another hit module by the Hickmans, one more character must enter the story. Margaret Weiss was a writer who was hired into the editing department of TSR. She met Tracy while they were working on various projects for the company, and soon, Weiss and Hickman ended up world-building Dragonlance on the job. An outside author was hired for the spin-off novels, with Weiss assigned to babysit this author. Yet, Margaret Weiss wasn't happy with the results and ended up just writing the novel herself. Dragons of Autumn Twilight. A novel that vastly outsold any and all expectations, and Weiss's specific writing style ended up having quite the profound effect on the fantasy industry. Now, we covered some adjacent history in my video on SnarfQuest. In that video, we talked about how Tolkien's Lord of the Rings novels ended up birthing modern fantasy. This is known by pretty much everyone, but what's less discussed is how it actually took decades before Tolkien-esque fantasy fully caught on and won the war for the throne to become the top literary movement in the fantasy genre. And that is because a different fantasy movement, pulp fantasy, which had started out in the late 1800s, was at its apex and the heights of its power just as Lord of the Rings came out. Conan would ultimately delay the rise of Tolkien-esque fantasy by decades by creating a wildly influential branch of pulp that we commonly know as sword and sorcery. In the SnarfQuest video, of course, we were much more focused on Tolkien-esque versus pulp fantasy artwork, but the general timeline actually holds up pretty well in the exact same way when we talk about the adjacent literary movement as well. Lord of the Rings was an absolute smash hit, but for quite a while its influence on the industry was that now all of the beefcake fantasy heroes were saving elves and fighting orcs. Worth noting, the emergence of Tolkien-esque fantasy as the dominant fantasy genre isn't such a simple thing to point at and say, this is how or when or why it happened. I'm focused on the genre element and the fan trends in this story, but to hear a different retelling of this from the publisher side, and the way in which publishers began shoving a rip-off Tolkien formula into everything, I would really recommend checking out the video, This Is Why We Never Got Another Lord of the Rings, by YouTuber The Second Story. It provides a contrasting view about how the genre was forced by publishers to fit into a box. And yet I think that video does miss the angle of how it managed to become popular with the audiences of the time, and I think Dragonlance is a big part of that story. Tolkien-esque, or epic fantasy, started trickling out over the years following the release of Lord of the Rings. A handful of the all-time greats were released over a 30-year period. Some were more Tolkien-esque than others, but they were all big sweeping epic fantasy works that were noticeably not pulp fantasy. A Wizard of Earthsea, Dragon Riders of Pern, The Last Unicorn, The Sword of Shannara, The Never-Ending Story, and a handful of minor, less influential series all came out at this time. Modern fantasy had a small little library of content when the year hit 1980. It was even established enough that by 1983, Terry Pratchett was able to write Discworld, a series that served as a raucous parody of the genre. In 1984, you also had The Black Company come out, which rejected the fantasy genre in a different sort of way, bringing a more grounded, dark, and military-focused fantasy. It feels a lot more like fantasy as we know it today. This is one of the first fantasy books that were written to counter the style of Lord of the Rings, which so much modern fantasy has spent like the last 20 or 30 years trying to do as well. But the big shift in fantasy came out in 1984, when Weiss and Hickman's Dragonlance novels hit the scene. Epic fantasy had been muddled together with sword and sorcery for a very long time, to the point where you can argue that they were probably not different genres at all. But Margaret Weiss wasn't really part of that movement. She didn't have the problem of lumping Tolkien in with Conan. And that's because Margaret Weiss didn't really like fantasy all that much. Actually, she only liked Lord of the Rings. So when she wrote Dragonlance, she essentially gave the world non-pulp Tolkien-esque fantasy in a way that a lot of people hadn't experienced since Lord of the Rings itself. Though, yes, many people had been getting their fix from Shannara as well. But what's more, Weiss was writing in clean, modern 1980s English and at a really basic level of prose, making it easily accessible to teenagers and children, many of whom had not read Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a tougher read every decade due to how dated the language is. Margaret Weiss's Tolkien revivalism made this an interesting work of fiction, but what put it over the edge and made it such a smash hit was the fact that it wasn't exactly uncut Tolkien-esque fiction. There was so much D&D in this book. From the crunchy Vancian magic, the recognizable classes and archetypes, the way that party members so often had to take time out of their day to just convince each other to do stuff. Because, Sturm's worried about his honor again. I feel like I'm referencing my past videos a lot, but in my last video, I gave some mention that D&D as a game and D&D as a literary movement are largely separate things. D&D as a literary movement managed to hit the shores of Japan even before D&D itself did. Well, that disconnected literary movement is a big part of why Dragons of Autumn Twilight was so successful. D&D was in this curious state where it was a game that had a popular literary movement surrounding it, but no actual serious devoted literature. The tropes were nebulous at this time. They hadn't been codified and set down in stone yet. D&D was actually still pretty pulpy back then, but with Weiss's writing now reaching millions of readers, the tone of D&D would warp to match. And beyond that, this was the spark that turned the popularity of D&D the game into a general hunger for fantasy literature. I've said a bunch of times already that Dragonlance is crazy influential in fiction, but that might be stolen valor. Probably around 60% of the influence of Dragonlance is just the wave of D&D it was riding on. But just try this, think for a second about generic fantasy. Picture it. And there is a kind of general agreement that such a thing exists. You might think that what you're picturing is Lord of the Rings. That feels like such an easy answer. After all, that's where modern fantasy originated. But whatever you've got in your head, you're probably not actually picturing anything that looks all that much like Lord of the Rings. Is the generic fantasy in your head a somber world where the mundane always wins and the magic eternally fades? Are the wizards in your generic world just literal angels sent by the gods, or can someone become a wizard? Are half-elves just regular elves with one parent who died really quick? Or are they tortured drifting souls eternally stuck between two worlds? There's this layer in between Tolkien-esque fantasy and modern fantasy, and that layer is Dragonlance. And that's not because Dragonlance wasn't creative or innovative. It's because it was so goddamn influential, again with the help of D&D beside it, that the entire genre selectively rejects or builds upon the Dragonlance tropes. And the D&D tropes, okay, I'm gonna stop saying that now. It's like Assassin's Creed. Go back and play the first one. It will feel real generic now, since hundreds of games have been built upon that formula since. But Assassin's Creed certainly didn't feel like that when it first came out, so I don't know if I can convince you about what makes Dragonlance special. Because the ways in which it is special have been ripped off, rejected, or built upon for 40 years at this point. But I am hoping, at the very least, you can now understand why Dragonlance is important. This is foundational fantasy, arguably more important for the development of fantasy than more prestigious works from that era. Half-elves aren't like Elrond. Half-elves are like Tanis, half-elven. I've tempered my statements a lot, by the way, about Dragonlance's big effects on fantasy, giving tremendous amounts of the credit to Dungeons & Dragons, with Dragonlance largely serving as the vehicle for D&D's literary movement. And that's all true, but it does kind of undersell how much Dragonlance shaped the version of D&D that reached the public eye. D&D was a lot more on the sword and sorcery spectrum, rather than the high fantasy spectrum, before Weiss's books yanked D&D's literary Overton window far in the direction of high fantasy. Plus, Dragonlance at its height was actually outselling core editions of D&D itself. There was a brief period where D&D was riding on the coattails of Dragonlance, rather than the other way around. Now, I've just been blabbing so far about the literature of it all, but what about the actual table side of this? What about the video games? Dragonlance has this thing where its wild success as a D&D literary series went hand in hand with its failure in every other medium. And ironically, when it comes to the tabletop at least, the novels are to blame for why the tabletop didn't catch on. The original Dragonlance Chronicles trilogy was meant to be tie-in media to promote the tabletop game. This is commonplace nowadays. Tabletop properties do this all the time. Warhammer especially is a master of it. But this was legitimately the first time that it was tried to make a serious multimedia push for a tabletop game. And because they didn't have any experience with how this goes, they did something very, very wrong. Something that kind of foiled the tabletop completely. Because they overshadowed it. The story roughly just followed the adventure modules, using the pre-generated characters. Dragonlance Chronicles was intended to be a good narrative example of the story. It would advertise what was possible, then hand it over to the players and say, okay, now play it your way. But then the novels were such a smash hit, and the pre-generated characters so popular and iconic, that they now overshadowed the tabletop module in a really unintended way. When you played the Dragonlance modules, it now felt like you were playing somebody else's story, or otherwise living in someone else's shadow. It would be like a Star Wars RPG where they delete Han, Leia, and Luke and just have you make 3 fanfic characters to take their place. And that's kind of interesting in a way, but it's a problem still. It's appealing to a very limited number of players. Dragonlance has a main cast of characters, and it's not you. Listen, it's a Heroes of the Lance world, and you're just living in it. And even if you do play as the pre-generated Heroes of the Lance, the modules are some of the most railroaded modules that D&D has ever written. The popularity of the novels accidentally transformed the tabletop games from a role-playing game into a reenactment game. The intent was clearly for a person to read the books, say, wow, that's really cool, and then DM a Dragonlance campaign for a group of players that had not read the novels. And this did not work at all, because Dragonlance absolutely saturated the role-playing space. It was a smash hit! You would have a really hard time recruiting players from the standard 80s and 90s stock without ending up with at least a couple of players who were Dragonlance nerds. Ironically, with 40 years having passed and a new generation mostly just having second-hand knowledge of Dragonlance, if they know about it at all, the old modules actually might hold up better today than they did when they were actually released. As for their overall quality, the general consensus among old gamers seems to be that they were fine. Some people loved them, some people hated them, but most who played them didn't seem to have been left with any strong opinions either way. The only common thing I hear about them is that, these things are wildly railroady. Wizards of the Coast tried to bring Dragonlance back a few years ago, and it actually failed to garner much attention. They basically did a reboot and set the story in parallel with the Heroes of the Lance, putting the new heroes just in the trenches as dragon armies battled overhead. And honestly, I think that's the right way to properly center the player characters in this setting, but this was also kind of the opportunity to just do a full reboot and update the OG modules the way that they did with Curse of Strahd and the original Ravenloft stuff. Either way, I'm sure we'll get that revamp one day, even if it takes another decade. Dragonlance's Silverbox games, however, are by far the worst thing to come out of the franchise by a wide margin. And they are what we are here to discuss. Yes, also the movie was real bad. Just terrible. I can't even believe it. I am going to use some footage of it because that will help a lot with the video editing side of this, but don't judge the series by the pictures you see on screen.
At least I'm not a half-breed.
This thing was an aberration. Nobody liked this movie. The images are just useful to illustrate plot details. But anyway, the video games, real bad, aren't they? The trilogy of them follow the story of the first novel, or more precisely, the first 3 tabletop modules. We're going to largely retell that story in this video, so that our games trilogy is connected in a sensible way. This is therefore a rough summary of the first novel. Now, if you actually want to read Dragonlance, this is where I have to plug the fact that I have a book club podcast titled It's Called a Lance, and we're covering the original Dragonlance trilogy right now, and we just finished the first novel. We set an easy pace, so it should be a pretty easy task to catch up to us at this point. But if you want, by the end of this video, you do technically have the bare minimum knowledge to skip book 1 entirely and just join us as we start the second novel. The second novel, by the way, is considered to be like the best one in the series. We've even made an episode 0 for book 2 that is designed to be listened to even if you've never touched a Dragonlance book before. So come check us out and see if It's Called a Lance is for you. We also streamed the very bad Dragonlance movie live a few weeks back, so yeah, you can hop on over, watch the VOD, and see that one if you like. We had a great time roasting the film. Dragonlance doesn't quite begin in a tavern. Even back in 1985, that trope was so worn that Dragonlance begins with a deconstruction of it. The Inn of the Last Home is a tavern built in the trees in a town called Solace. It was once the watering hole for a group of young adventurers who were based in this town. They split up for 5 years to find the gods, and this was the day that they agreed to reconvene and tell each other what they found. Why are the gods missing, you ask? Great question. A long time ago, the forces of good utterly smashed the forces of darkness under a god-chosen hero named Huma. Yet, being on the side of good doesn't de facto make you good. Thus, mortal evil remained on the world. And over time, the world grew stagnant and corrupt. The king priest of Istar, ruler of the greatest kingdom on Krynn, grew paranoid and power-hungry. He saw evil everywhere and wished to eliminate it. The king priest called to the gods in a great ritual, demanding the powers that Huma had been given so that he might rule with absolute power in their name. The gods were of course appalled at what the mortals had done with the world that they had been given. Instead of gifts, all that they sent to the king priest was a mountain of fire. Istar shattered, the world broke, seas dried and plains flooded, and when clerics begged for aid, the gods did not answer, for they had left Krynn in disgust. Now, 300 years later, a faction called the Seekers have begun looking for new gods, and some claim to have found them. And yet the heroes of the last home have remained skeptical of such claims. Thus they began their adventure to find the truth of the gods. And now, they have each returned to share with each other what they've found. The story begins on the road to the tavern for their reunion. Tanis Half-Elven and Flint Fireforge find each other upon the road. And Tanis isn't just a half-elf. He's the half-elf. As I said earlier, when you think of half-elves, you probably don't think of Elrond, who is basically just an elf who had a rougher-than-normal childhood. Instead, knowingly or not, you're probably thinking of Tanis from Dragonlance. If this series can be said to have had a protagonist, it's him. In some ways, he's the group's straight man, being more grounded and straightforward than all of the others. He's never struggled with doing the right thing very much. He's just a guy who kinda lives and breathes down-to-earth heroism and morality. But he's also quite complicated in his way. He was raised by the elves and had just a miserable time with it. It's left him with a deep and unresolved angst. He's by far the most emotional and passionate member of the team. Reading between the lines, the boy also gets really easily swept up into romances that do not end well. And interestingly, he also very meaningfully struggles with age. Being a half-elf means that everyone just moves at different speeds than you. Tanis' childhood crush was an elf, and she remained still mentally a child when Tanis' own mind rapidly reached a teenage equivalence. And this would end up being something of a problem for Tanis. On the other hand, Tanis settled down in Solus a few decades later, and helped mentor some young boys how to use a sword. By the time they split 5 years ago, most of them stopped feeling like Tanis was an uncle and started feeling like he was a brother. And now, after 5 years apart, Tanis is going to be confronted with the fact that these teenage boys he taught 10 years ago are now world-weary, and some of them more mature than he is. Tanis always felt like he had a special relationship with the dwarf Flint. They've been friends since even before Tanis was exiled, and in that time, Flint has remained roughly equivalent to him. Dwarves, of course, being the closest to half-elves in terms of rate of aging. Flint Fireforge is kind of a fun concept character. He's an old, grumbling smith and fighter who is well past his prime. While he can still scrap, the party usually keeps him behind the lines to protect the squishy party members. He's less of a combatant these days and more of a mentor character. He's stubborn beyond what seems reasonable, and frequently invents new things to be stubborn about, like an extremely inconsistent allergy to horses. He's also extremely racist. I mean, he is old. Tanis and Flint tell each other that they've had exactly zero luck locating signs of the gods, and they hope that the others had more luck than they did. A third member of their band, Tasselhoff Burfoot, meets the party. Tasselhoff is what Dragonlance calls a kender. What is a kender? It's a bit complicated, actually. D&D halflings were always Hobbit ripoffs. They were literally just called hobbits until the Tolkien estate sued them over it. Kender were an attempt to make a more unique short folk creature for D&D that weren't just short, dutiful people who garden and eat a lot. And it's tough to explain to a modern audience why Kender are different from halflings, because after Dragonlance, D&D just started making all of their halflings and gnomes act like Kender. Surprisingly, Out of every last species in the Dragonlance setting, Kender are the ones that have the most alien psychology to humans. They literally just do not feel the emotion of fear. They also have Giga ADHD, which, yes, ADHD is a human trait, but Kender have like 10 times the amount that humans do. Everyone on Kryn thinks that Kender are all thieves, but that's just because they get really curious about your belongings because they're really cool, and then they get distracted and then they just kind of pocket the item without noticing they've done it. In the same way that Tanis is the half-elf, Tasselhoff is the halfling, being just a massive part of where the modern trope comes from. But much like with Tanis, the trope has actually degraded a bit from its origin. Tass's legacy has been very much Flanderized over the years, as one of my podcast viewers pointed out, with Kender, halflings, and gnomes erring on the side of annoying cartoon characters ever since. Which is surprising actually, because Tasselhoff isn't really like that. He's kind of a guy's guy, actually. You know, he pulls out the booze when it's time to drink, he trash talks the enemies, and his pranks are actually funny. Also, it's amazing that no one in D&D history has ever succeeded at making a better Kender or halfling name than Tasselhoff Burfoot. Unbelievably good name. This trio of heroes gets stopped on the road by a hobgoblin named Viewmaster Toad. He's working for a seeker who has taken over Solace while the heroes were gone. They're looking for a blue crystal staff, but they're happy to try and shake down the heroes while they're at it. Toad flees the scene while Tass, Flint, and Tanis kill some goblins. The party soon arrives at the Inn of the Last Hope, where they meet two more of their companions, the Magir twins. The twins are, in some ways, the beating emotional heart of the franchise. In fact, the sequel trilogy, which is just about as beloved as the first, had these two as the heart of the tale. They're a pretty simple trope, you know, a big himbo fighter and a frail scheming mage. But the devil has always been in the details with these two. Caramon the fighter has always been the more straightforward of the pair. He's a big, kind-hearted, rowdy boy who fusses over his frail brother. Raistlin, however, is... well, I mean, he's Raistlin. He's the most famous Dragonlance character by far. His legacy isn't tropes that he inspired. Raistlin's legacy is Raistlin himself. This is a character who broke containment. If you've heard of any Dragonlance character, it's probably him. I mean, there was a kid in my school when I was little named Raistlin. Raistlin takes the frail mage trope and turns it up to 11. His test at the Tower of High Sorcery magically broke his body. His skin burned into a metallic bronze, his hair prematurely white from the shock, his eyes transformed into hourglasses, cursed to look upon other people and only see the way that they decay. He is obviously sinister, and wears the neutral red robes that mark him as a character neither wholly good nor wholly evil. Raistlin comes off immediately as an edgelord, and he is an edgelord, but damn is he fun to watch. Everyone but Caramon sees Raistlin and knows the inevitable turn to evil is coming, but when? Every time something bad happens, everyone points their fingers at him, as though he'd waste his grand inevitable betrayal on something so banal. But you can also see how the suspicions people had of Raistlin over his life have shaped him into this way. He has this punk goth side to him as well. You say I'm a bad guy because you don't trust my spells, you think I'm sinister, then fine. I'll play the part, I'll be every bit as menacing as you tell me I am. Because he is a goth, he is a punk, but he's also a theater kid. Deep down, the ambitious mage is only in part what he claims to be. Raistlin's greatest magic is really just playing off people's preconceived notions of him. He loves the theater of being a dark wizard. A number of times in the series, his spells aren't even real or as great as he claims, but everyone just accepts that, oh, of course, that guy must know some real dark forbidden magic, right? The relationship between him and Caramon is a real Rorschach test for the community. Some look at it and they see a brother dragging his loner twin out to make friends and trying to protect him and keep him out of trouble, all while Raistlin's just ingrateful and fights everyone and insults Caramon. Others look at the two and see Raistlin as an outcast loner, shackled to his meathead brother, and dragged into a den of bullies who look down upon him. Is it any wonder that Raistlin resents how badly he needs his brother's help? Ultimately, the complexity of the relationship between the Magier brothers is a big driver of what makes Dragonlance what it is. Oh, and to make things even more complicated, there's a wild and headstrong half-sister, Kitiara, who is kind of a blend of Raistlin's sinister edge and Caramon's wild and haughty personality and physique. Also, Tanis is just head over heels for her. She hasn't arrived here yet, though, and Tanis has not been doing a great job of playing it cool that she's not here. The heroes begin to catch up with each other, and it's obvious that Caramon is extremely interested in the fiery barmaid, Tika, who was a few years younger than him. That said, over the 5 years he's been gone, she's, developed. We see a bit more from Tika earlier in the book. She welcomed in an obvious wizard named Fizban, who has taken a seat by the fire. The only thing you really need to know about Fizban is that he's like a sillier Gandalf, played for comedy. It is important to know that he's there, though. Soon enters the final hero of the group. No, not Kitiara, but Sturm Brightblade. He's a Knight of Solamnia, an order of heroic knights with a strict code of conduct. They're sort of implied to be like 50% European knights and 50% samurai, tonally speaking. Unfortunately, when millions cried out in terror and begged the knights to save them from the cataclysm, the knights could do nothing. And so, the people revile them for that, and they haven't stopped hating them. Sturm is a curious sort. He was raised in Solus, his father a Knight of Solamnia, who Sturm knew next to nothing about. Sturm struggles because he does know the knightly code, but he wasn't properly raised on it. He didn't get the parables, the explanations, the reasons for each tenet. He's had to piece all of the wisdom behind it together for himself, and it often feels hollow. He admires Tanis greatly, for the level of easy morality that the half-elf embodies is what Sturm tries to be with great effort by following the oath that he doesn't always understand. Sturm is rigid and impractical, but he's also quick to act when the oath binds him to. Sturm is, believe it or not, the #1 fan favorite character. He seems like a bit of a cartoon knight for a time, but he's got one of the most satisfying and complete character arcs in the entire series, as Sturm finally lives up to the person he's trying so hard to be. No spoilers in the comments section, Dragonlance fans. Yes, you and I, we both know. The others, they don't know. Just let them read the book. Spoiling it for them won't have the same effect. Point is, Sturm's story arc feels retroactively perfect when you understand where it goes later. There were 80s and 90s nerds who tried to follow the Solamnic Oath, just like people tried to follow the Jedi Code. Sturm Brightblade consumed a few people's lives. Sturm entered the Inn of the Last Home, escorting 2 tribesmen from the Quayshu tribe to the east, Goldmoon and Riverwind. They appreciate Sturm's escort, but they're still extremely standoffish. The two are clearly a couple, and Riverwind is staring daggers at anyone who dares look their way. The group continues catching up, until a letter from Kitiara tells everyone that she isn't coming. The oath is broken. Elsewhere in the tavern, the High Seeker of Solus, who has largely acted as a belligerent dictator, takes issue with Fizban telling a story about the old gods. The drunken Seeker starts throwing wild accusations, until a shove accidentally throws them into the fireplace. He is badly burned and screaming in agony. Fizban snatches up Goldmoon's staff and hands it to Tasselhoff, telling him to use it to knock over the poor fool so that they can put him out. In plain view of everyone, though, the staff extinguishes the fire and heals the Seeker's burns. The staff glows like blue crystal. The Seeker, of course, has absolutely no gratitude to speak of, and attempts to seize the barbarian and take the staff. The heroes don't stand idly by, and they soon find themselves caught up in the struggle. A rushed escape is made out the back, and the party flees Solus with goblin guards hot on their heels. On the road, they learn more about Goldmoon and Riverwind. She was the chieftain's daughter, and he a lowborn tribesman. Their love was forbidden, and the chief attempted to be rid of Riverwind by sending him on an impossible task to find the gods. And Riverwind did. He returned a decade later with foggy memories of an ancient temple and death and black wings. He gifted the blue crystal staff to Goldmoon, yet the chief wouldn't accept the staff, and had Riverwind stoned to death instead for daring to court his daughter. Goldmoon rushed in to block the stones, but the two of them were mysteriously teleported in a flash of light to Solus, where Sturm found them milling about and confused. Antics, of course, happen on the road. Riverwind tries repeatedly to convince Goldmoon that they should ditch the party, until eventually he begins to trust them as well. The party hopes to go to Haven to consult with the other Seekers about the staff, but they never quite make it. A band of monks attack the party, turning out to be twisted dragon-like humans called Draconians, who seek the blue crystal staff. More are coming, and the gang flees into a dark forest. There they meet with ghosts and a unicorn named the Forest Master. The Forest Master greets them and puts them on the actual road towards a real objective, instead of just running blindly towards Haven. They must instead turn around and go east to seek out a city named Zack-Tsaroth, which was shattered during the Cataclysm. There they will find more about this crystal staff and its origins. The party is given a ride on Pegasi to get past their pursuers, but they aren't taken the whole way, just to the plains near Goldmoon and Riverwind's Quayshu tribe. They are nervous to return, but they overcome it quickly when they spot billowing smoke coming from the village. And guys, I'm gonna be real, Book 1 of Dragonlance is easily the weakest of the original Chronicles trilogy, and it's often accused of being quite a bit more simple and childish than the rest of the series. Yet this right here, this is one of the most devastatingly visceral scenes in 80s fantasy. The tribesmen are all dead, burned alive by fire or put to the sword. A group of soldiers have been executed by someone named Verminard for refusing to execute prisoners. A small dog gently licks the body of a burned child, whimpering that his friend won't wake. Riverwind and Goldmoon are utterly shell-shocked, and the others are affected by the sights of this massacre for the rest of their days. But eventually they reach Zack-Tsaroth. Riverwind's broken memories begin coming together. This is where he found the staff. This is where he saw death, and she had black wings. Emerging from a well, she bursts forth. Kisanth, a black dragon of terrifying beauty. Goldmoon disappears as the party desperately defends itself. Riverwind is caught by the acid breath, his skin bubbling and melting away. Tanis has grown fond of the man, and is horrified to see that Riverwind is still alive in his gory, melted state. Sturm urges Tanis to end it. They won't let their friend suffer like this. But before the half-elf can put Riverwind out of his misery, Goldmoon bids them to come and enter a temple structure she found. Goldmoon has found a shrine to an ancient goddess, Mishakal, and formed a bond with this goddess. The staff was hers. She wanted Goldmoon to come here. She was calling for them. The golden-haired tribeswoman confidently asks for them to bring Riverwind forth for healing, but fails to keep her cool when she sees just how badly melted her lover is. Yet, the light of Mishakal restores the plainsmen, and Goldmoon's faith is answered. It seemed it was mortals who turned away from the gods first, placing their faith in the king priest instead. The gods only departed when they realized how thoroughly they had lost the mortals. Down below in the broken city, Goldmoon tells the heroes, are the discs of Mishakal that hold the ancient wisdom of the gods. It's, well, I mean, if it wasn't obvious by now, the Hickmans are Mormon. It's like high fantasy, high fantasy, high fantasy, and then boom, Goldmoon is Joseph Smith. Anyway, this is where Game 1 of our Silverbox trilogy begins. You take control of the heroes of the Lance as they descend into the Lost City to find the discs of Mishakal. I actually streamed this game on Twitch a few weeks back for my playtest, and I'm planning on streaming more of my playthroughs there starting soon. So follow me on Twitch, link in the description if you want to hang out as we plumb the depths of tabletop video games. And call to actions go here, I guess, since we've already started this. Like the video if you're enjoying the content. I cover the video game adaptations of tabletop franchises like D&D, Warhammer, World of Darkness, and more. So subscribe to the channel if you like what I'm laying down here. Now, before we cover the video game's version of events in Zaxxaroth, let's quickly skim through how it actually goes in the books. The gang descends into the city and are immediately confronted by gully dwarves, which are sort of lesser dwarven riffraff who are hated by the other dwarves. Flint wants to fight them, as he was previously held captive by gully dwarves for several years. Also, he's racist.
Gully dwarfs! The stupidest, most vile creatures that I am!
Look, Draconians!
But Raistlin instead casts friendship upon the dirty little gully folk. He becomes remarkably paternal towards the filthy dwarves and strikes a friendship with the cleverest one, Bupu, who seems to admire him. Bupu leads the party to the High Bulp, evading and fighting Draconians as they go. The party discovers that the discs are guarded by Kisanth the dragon, and thus a heist must be planned. The High Bulp, however, isn't one to waste a band of heroes. His people have been enslaved by this dragon. I mean, not him, he just gets to hang out in his throne room, but like the dragon's hoarding all the treasure, he wants some of that treasure. He would much rather that the heroes kill the dragon so that the gully dwarves stop having to be slaves. And also, he could get a lot of treasure that way. He helps the heroes plan their heist, but sabotages the plan to ensure a face-off between them and the dragon. The plan begins and inevitably fails. Raistlin is captured below Kisanth's talon. She's not here to bargain. The heroes are beneath her. At one point, the heroes throw out the old, let the mage go, it's me you want. And Kisanth says, fuck, what? No, I don't want any of you miserable fucking creatures. Just hand me the staff and we'll see if you can beg me for a shot at not dying after. Goldmoon agrees against the party's protest and slowly approaches the great dragon, staff in hand. All at once, she cracks it against Kisanth's hide. The divine relic shatters, burning the dragon up in blue fire, and Goldmoon with it. The whole party is in shock, and Riverwind is inconsolable. The destruction of the staff is causing the whole chamber to break apart, and the party scrambles to find the discs of Meshakal. Once they've been found among the treasure hoard, Raistlin needs to be practically dragged out, as he's heard that this treasure hoard also holds a powerful spellbook. Tanis remains to try and argue Riverwind into coming with them, but the distraught plainsman simply wants to die. Fate has other plans though. A falling rock cracks Tanis over the head and knocks him out. Riverwind is forced to leave, carrying Tanis with him, for he doesn't want the half-elf to die today. On the surface, Tanis wakes up and enters the temple, roaring his anger at Meshakal for demanding mortals like Goldmoon give up their lives in sacrifice. To the surprise of all, Goldmoon emerges reborn completely, and now the first cleric of Meshakal in hundreds of years. Before the party departs, Bupu gifts Raistlin this fancy evil spellbook she found, and Raistlin wishes his little friend a happy and prosperous life with the newly freed gully dwarves. And that is what happened in the overlapping time period of the game. It marks the halfway point of Dragons of Autumn Twilight. Now, let's begin the much inferior game version of what happened here. Worth noting, I'm playing the NES version of the game. I'm told that the Commodore version is better, but I had not been told that when I started playing. Certainly the graphics are better. I'm playing this version largely because that's the version I bounced off of 3 years ago, and damn it, this time I was in it to win it. Hours were spent in those early days of William SRD's channel, trying to figure out how to make it past the very first room, before giving up and playing Descent into Undermountain instead. Now, the trick is this. We enter the building and spawn in front of this door. Thus, it can be assumed that this door is where we came from. Inevitably, you will then try over and over to jump over this pit, and you will die, and you will lose the game. The systems in this game are absolutely wild. When a doorway is crossed through, the camera essentially rotates 90 degrees. Thus, the way you came from is now actually on the left side of the screen. This little zone here, because you're like, what the hell? I entered this dungeon through this door. I am beside a door. The thing is, the door we entered to get in here isn't the door we're in front of. We started from this way. That's where the door was. So these two doors that we spawn in front of we are able to go through, and there's also a door below us. I figured that out this time, and then after all these years, I got to actually start the game. This is as far as I made it back then. In the defense of my past self, I was new to playing old and intensely janky games back then. I am way more resourceful now. Space Hulk changes a man. Combat begins soon after, and it's similarly bad. There's a high and a low plane that you can aim at to attack, and there are a lot of short enemies. Attacking normally just with the default attack key will only hit the high plane. You instead need to use the janky directional command that doesn't work very well if you want to attack the short enemies, which are mostly gully dwarves, by the way. That's right, you have to slaughter Raceland's little helpers in this version en masse. It's like a Star Wars Metroidvania where Luke has to kill all the Ewoks. But the height difference in combat works to your benefit too, because the enemies also have an equally hard time aiming low. When you choose to control Tasselhoff or Flint, you'll find a massive number of attacks are just sailing right over your head. Flint may not have the best stats in this game, but he's probably the best and most powerful character just due to how few attacks hit him. This isn't the only difference between the characters though. They all have slight differences to them and what they bring to the table. Dragonlance has the problem where literally all but 3 of the heroes of the Lance were just fighters. At least by AD&D standards. You know, every friend group got the fighter, 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 and fighter, and these weirdos here. But credit where it's due, Heroes of the Lance does make all of these fighters act a little bit different from one another. Some of them have bows, Caramon throws a spear, and I'd actually really like it if Google Docs would stop auto-correcting his name to Cardamom. It doesn't even give me the red squiggle, it just changes the word without me asking it to. Still though, all these differences between the fighters isn't enough to create real gameplay variety. Every fight usually begins with you using some form of ranged weapon, and then you just hammer the attack button and have Goldmoon spam healing after combat as needed. Now, hold on. Why is it that Goldmoon can spam healing spells? In the novel, she only becomes a cleric after the dungeon, not before. The game actually does recognize this, and instead relies on the cleric powers of the Blue Crystal Staff. It's got a pool of a few hundred charges. Each cleric spell costs a different number of charges, and they are precious. You also don't get your charges back, so don't go too hard on these things. Interestingly, they chose to do the same stuff with Raceland. They could have gotten him to use the AD&D Vancian magic system, but instead they just gave the Staff of Magius spell charges as well, just the exact same way as Goldmoon's staff. A bit weird honestly, but for a game like this I do think it made more sense to just do one spell system like this, instead of having 2 different spell systems. The problem comes from the fact that you have a limited number of spell charges, but an unlimited number of enemies. They all respawn when you re-enter a room, so you best not backtrack if you know what's good for you. That's a lot easier said than done though. Let me show you this bloody map that someone made. Yeah, that's kind of a lot, huh? It's all made worse by the fact that the cardinal directions change every time you enter a room. It's so disorienting, and chat watched me try in vain during my stream to map the dungeon. Instead, I just decided to always head east, or, south if east was impossible. And to my surprise, it actually worked, and I was soon progressing the dungeon. It gets better for a while as the terrain begins to look a lot more varied in the Gully Dwarf village. Yet, once you're in Kissant's lair, everything suddenly looks identical, and navigation becomes nearly impossible again. Now, navigation is terrible, but the UI is probably worse here. You'll spend most of the game in here swapping characters, re-equipping Caramon's spear, cause, he threw it, casting spells, or doing just other sub-menu busy work. Fortunately, there is at least a system for using ranged weapons without flipping through the menus. Last major point of review. The music. I liked it. I actually use one of the tracks in my Dragonlance podcast as my intro music. But Heroes of the Lance does way overplay all of the tracks, to the point where I had like a half dozen viewers over the playthrough tell me that they just had to duck out of the stream because the music was so repetitive. Your mileage may vary, but I think it's fair to say that the individual songs were some classic good NES generation music. And then, after all that wandering aimlessly, all those close calls, all of the spam heals and annoying Gully Dwarf fights, we reach the boss, Kisanth. It's an epic fight, in which Goldmoon throws the staff and Kisanth dies in a single hit. And that's it. Heroes of the Lance? Worst D&D game of all time? Nah, not by my count. Undermountain was a bit worse moment to moment, and also way longer. In fact, this one was so unexpectedly short that I just kept going with the streams. Hence why we are now unexpectedly covering the trilogy of games rather than just the first game. Heroes of the Lance sucked, and it had one of the least intuitive UI systems I have ever seen. That's your big high-level summary. Also, it basically didn't even try to cover the story of the books. Only positive thing I have to say is that some of the still image pixel art was quite solid. Now, let's move on. Game 2 starts immediately after, and I mean like immediately following the exit from the dungeon. So, just like before, let's go through the novel's version of events first. The gods are once again on side, right where they're supposed to be. The discs are obtained and Goldmoon is resurrected. But all is not well. There is smoke on the wind. Solus, their hometown, is burning. The Seeker sold them all out to Verminard's dark goddess. We cut to the POV of Tika. Verminard's dragon army swept through town, stealing, burning, killing, and enslaving. The Draconians have only left behind anything that makes this place work better as a military outpost. And they consider the Inn of the Last Home to be an adequate watering hole for their troops. But to add insult to the situation, a dragon picked up the inn and dropped it on the ground so the Draconians wouldn't have to climb up the stairs. Now Tika serves the invaders, shell-shocked, angry, and in despair. The heroes arrive a few days after the occupation and in disguise. They don't dress up too creatively though, as they assume that the goblin guards have likely been too busy to properly recognize them after their scuffle a few days ago. Now, the heroes of the Lance are good at many different things, but disguises are not one of them, and it falls through pretty much immediately. The gang is captured and sent to a cart to drag them all off to slavery. This time, with Tika getting grabbed alongside them. An elf from the bar gets captured with them. Tanis realizes with some surprise that it's Gilthanas, his ex-childhood best friend, who suddenly had a problem with Tanis being half-human after Tanis and Gilthanas' sister became a thing. Also taken with them is Fizban, that old guy and obvious wizard from way earlier. A blacksmith is thrown in as well to complete the team. He was Gilthanas' contact in starting a resistance, but the plan ultimately fell through. The Draconians have cut off the smith's arm in punishment, and he seems likely to die here. Despite Gilthanas protesting that the barbarian should just let his friend die in peace, Goldmoon muscles in and saves the smith's life, and showing to all that she is the first true cleric of good gods in hundreds of years. A batch of elven archers ambush the prison caravan, but they're neither careful nor thorough. Arrows fly everywhere. It's only Gilthanas they are here to save, and he's gonna have to bust out of the cart himself. The gang manages to escape with him after some of Fizban's antics, and then they have to convince Gilthanas to take them in. He's not happy about it. Tanis, of course, is of mixed mind about sheltering in the elven realm of Qualinesti. He left this place decades ago, and he's never been keen to return. Yet, return he does, and is quickly confronted with the one person he didn't want to see. The others are all shocked by Lorana Kanan, an elf of such unspeakable beauty that it's actually kind of a problem. Which, by the way, Lorana is certainly not Tracy Hickman writing in his wife Laura. Certainly not, no way. These two are so fucking cute, I swear to God. Lorana is Tanis' ex, the one that he had been in sync with as a child, but due to his human blood, rapidly outmatured. He started to realize that, oh wait, this isn't like a real relationship, is it? This is like the thing where like two kids claim that they're gonna get married. And if this is a real relationship, I don't think this is gonna go well for me. I mean, I'm old enough now that I'm starting to notice all the slurs that everyone yells at me all the time. Tanis tried to explain this to Lorana, but she was naive and went to Big Brother Gilthanas to try and smooth things over. Cue Gilthanas getting really into anti-miscegenation. Anyway, back to Lorana. In all these, 50 or so years that Tanis has been exiled and growing a beard and learning to be a full adult, Laurana has successfully become a teenager mentally, and she's still very much hung up on Tanis all these decades later. Tanis, however, is a full-blown man at this point. Not a terribly old one, he's probably like early 20s mentally, but either way, he's disgusted by Laurana still acting like this, and he rejects her outright, breaking her heart and tells her that he's in love with Kitiara. Eventually, the gang meets with her father, the Speaker of the Sun and the leader of the Qualinesti Elves. The forest is to be abandoned, for Verminard's dragon armies are on their way. No shelter or help can be offered to the heroes, save one long shot. Verminard's fortress lies to the south, Pax Tharkus. Gilthanas knows the way to a secret tunnel, also called the Slaamori, which, yes, is just secret tunnel in Elven. Then you humans, you people, have the privilege of leading a slave revolt to distract Verminard while we elves flee to safety. It's not talked about enough how good of a job they do at making the elves in this series kind of just the worst. Anyway, before they can leave, Laurana ambushes Tanis, who I remind you has spent the last 50 years as a fighter, and she ambushes him in the middle of the night, and is somehow surprised when he pulls a knife at the shadowy figure hovering over his bedroll. It finally dawns on her that, Tanis may not be the same guy as all those years ago. But either way, she's come back with a deal. She has agreed to forgive Tanis for Kitiara if he will be her boyfriend again. And also, she's gonna stop bugging him about that stupid ugly human beard. He can keep it, for now. Tanis tells her to just go the hell away and leave him alone. The gang departs, with Tika fully stepping up now. She's bashed a few draconians at this point with a cast iron pan, and it seems that she's gained class levels as a fighter now. She is essentially useless with a sword, but apparently frying pan skills have translated to shield bash talent. They end up fighting some enemies on the road, and she ends up just absolutely caving in a draconian skull with her shield. And Karamon's like, okay, that was a lot, let me take that shield from you. And then this wild woman says, fuck it, I'm a fighter now. I'm kissing this big himbo. And then she makes out with Karamon, who seems both surprised and pleased with this turn of events. The party finds a captured freedom fighter named Eben, who begins chatting with Gilthanas about how there's obviously a traitor about, and it could be any one of you. But not me. It wouldn't be me. And the gang says, traitor? Hang on. We know a guy like that. They reach the Slaamori, and assorted dungeon encounters happen. There's a slime, a banshee, and Tanis finds an ancient elven sword. They also find Laurana, who followed them here to prove to Tanis that she's really not immature at all. Actually, now, Tanis, do you want to hold hands or something? Dungeons are kind of scary. And let me tell you, if he wasn't done before, Mr. Half-Elven is absolutely done with Laurana now. Listen here, dumb fuck. We can't spare anyone to bring you back to your dad. We also can't fucking babysit you. So just stay close and try not to die. She says, not to worry, Tanis. I've been trained in ceremonial combat. Anyway, she's here for entirely the wrong reasons. But tagging along behind a gang of talented killers actually turns out to be a really good way to shake off the folly of youth. And this is the beginning of Laurana Kanan's character arc, which will stretch over all 3 books. It won't pan out a ton over this first book, but damn, Laurana is one of the characters in Dragonlance who really goes a long way over the trilogy. Humble beginnings for what will turn out to be one of the most impressive characters in the franchise. That's all I'm gonna say. In all the hubbub, Tass and Fizban get separated and have some humorous antics, while the others do more important stuff. They're a decent comic duo. Fizban does slapstick Gandalf jokes while Tasselhoff goes, wow, over and over. It's great, it never gets old. We cut POVs a lot in the Pax Tharkus section, and we get to see Verminard and his dragon, Ember, who are really more rivals than partners. Verminard is a cleric of the Dark Lady Takesis, so he recognizes that the spiritual war is the #1 priority here. Meanwhile, Ember is a dragon, and he's not really into following a human's commands. Besides, he's got orders of his own he's working on for the Dark Queen, so he's not huge on helping Verminard with this, blue crystal side quest. Ember's also making frequent contact with the traitor. I wonder who it could be. Racelyn. Various quests happen as the heroes make contact with the prisoners. Goldmoon finds a dying seeker named Elliston and heals him. The guy looks about, sighs, and goes, "Yeah, okay, I guess the gods are probably real, huh?" And then he becomes High Cleric instead of Goldmoon. It's not fucking fair. I hate this guy. He didn't even work for this shit. Okay, no, he doesn't become High Cleric on the spot, but damn near. He gets a real quick run through from Goldmoon, and then by the time they've escaped, all the refugees are coming to him to learn about the gods. Goddamn welfare cleric, walking into my story and start taking jobs from hard-working barbarian princesses. Anyway, the Draconians have been splitting the slaves up. Women, children, and men, all in different holdings so that no one can escape without their families. They start making contact individually with each group, and go in disguise as women to go visit the children to go fetch them. For some of the heroes, the disguise is more convincing than the others. They find that the children have all been taken care of by an ancient and decrepit dragon named Flamestrike. She lost her own children during the first dragon war against Huma, and has since lost her mind, viewing the human children as her own Dragonlance. The children absolutely love this old grandma dragon. And when the hero's disguise fails, because, I repeat, they are really bad at disguises, the children are practically tackling the heroes to try and protect the dragon. The heroes narrowly manage to escape from Flamestrike, and it's mostly because they use the children as human shields. The prison riot all manages to go topside to flee from the gates, but the traitor has tipped off Verminard and Ember, who emerges to stop the escape. Eben is revealed to be the traitor, which is a surprise to everyone, and he attempts to escape through the gate before the cast gets set ablaze. Instead, the gate closes atop him, and the boy is destroyed. But more importantly, fine, Raistlin, you weren't the traitor this time, but we all saw you thinking about being the traitor. Verminard stands atop Ember and delivers one of the more sadistic villain speeches. He's going to kill them all, like animals. Not just the slave men, but the slave women, and the slave children too. That's right, they proudly proclaim that they're going to burn the children. But the children have a protector. Flamestrike emerges to protect her strange pink babies that she thinks are dragons from their assailant. Verminard tumbles off his mount back into the crowd, where he hefts his mace, Midnight, and squares off with the party. Now, Verminard is a cleric, and like any boss cleric, he's an absolute pain in the ass with all those debuffs. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Fizban and Tass end their adventure with a great fall. Fizban gets the spell wrong when he attempts to cast Featherfall, and instead conjures a massive pile of feathers for Tass to land on safely, while Fizban splatters to his death. And this time, Tasselhoff doesn't go, "Wow!" Lorana scores a kill and discovers, "Oh my, I appear to be good at this. You put this sword inside of the slow, clumsy creatures and they just die. Oh, how unexpected. Everyone always said this was hard." Verminard is absolutely crushing the heroes of the Lance. So long as the Queen of Darkness keeps feeding him spell slots, he's invincible. But in the heavens, with the Queen of Darkness looking on from up high, the fight takes a turn. The head of the Gods of Light, Paladine, returns to the world in a flash. Takhisis is startled. She knew she'd have to fight him, but not just out of the blue like this, she's not ready. She's gotta get ready if the real enemies are here. Verminard, his goddess having fled now and abandoned him to his fate, just gets dismantled piece by piece by the heroes of the Lance, and his head separated from his shoulders. And then this happened.
Verminard!
My children will live!
The prisoners are free, and Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the first book of the Dragonlance Chronicles trilogy, is finished. Now for the game! What does the game do with the story we just told? Game number 2. Dragons of Flame. Kind of a stretch goal, if we're being real. Reminder, I was only supposed to review the first game, but then I beat it really fast, so here we are with the sequel. Now, believe it or not, that first game actually reviewed okay in the gaming magazines at launch time. It was one of those times when people liked a game just fine on launch, and then opinion rapidly turned on it as the hype of the SSI era began to wind down. As such, it sold well enough and was cheap enough to produce that a sequel was released in 1998. It intended to take the style of the first game and really push the envelope. Instead, they shoved that damn envelope clear off the table. Folks, this game is somehow even worse despite all the new features. Just like the novel, we start the tale in Solace. The characters say, "Aw, dang, the villagers have all been kidnapped. Did you guys know that there's a fort to the south named Pax Tharkus? That sounds pretty evil. I bet that's where the bad guy is." And then they just set off, skipping like the entire plot. Now we get this nice big overland map that we will be on for like 15 minutes total in gameplay. It's fine for what it is, but I do have some complaints. Mainly that the enemies move way too fast and in such an unpredictable way that it makes it absolutely impossible to deke them out. When the enemies do inevitably catch us, we go to the side-scroller screen. Enemies will always have you surrounded, so you need to rush one side to avoid getting crushed between them. They're always quite far apart though, so it's never a particularly big concern. What's more concerning is, wow, these graphics are actually somehow worse in this game. Not sure how that happened. And the graphics aren't the only thing that is significantly worse between games. We've also got a problem with all these like little counterintuitive tweaks, such as how ranged weapons work. In the first game, it was simple. Make sure it's equipped, then at any time there's a little button combo to fire the bow or throw your spear or axe or whatever else. In Game 2, however, they seem to have just gotten rid of the button combo, and you now have to go into the submenu and fire every single arrow manually. Yes, every single shot. There are times when you need to shoot a dozen arrows to kill an enemy who's like camping a ledge. This mechanic, it's like pulling teeth, and there's no reason for it. It worked just fine in Game 1. Anyway, we reach Pax Tharkus, but it's locked. Gilthanas is nearby though, so we go talk to him. In this version, Gilthanas is of course a stranger who we are meeting for the first time, and he has no history with Tanis whatsoever. We chat with him, and he brings us to Qualinesti for an extended rest. We've been told by passerby that we met that hundreds are dying each day at Pax Tharkus, so naturally we kick up our feet for a few months with the elves. Anyway, the elves send us off to the Slamori with Gilthanas as our guide. I accidentally returned to the Elf City, and we time-skip 3 more months. Therefore, thousands more dead in the fortress. Oops. Now, as we set off, you might be thinking, where is Lorana? Great question. The game manual implies that you can find her somewhere, but all the walkthroughs and strategy guides that I find, they don't mention her at all. Is she in this game? I don't know, doesn't sound like it. Anyway, now we leave the overworld and the proper game starts. Combat is just like before, but slightly less obnoxious, while simultaneously a lot more difficult. Spell pools also drain way faster in this game, but there are more opportunities to rest and reset your spell charges. Otherwise, the gameplay is overall quite similar. It's uncanny, actually. It feels like they completely remade the game engine from scratch, but then changed very little, and they just worked off the same original design document. It's super uncanny. The one thing that they changed a lot from the original design though is making the map absolutely psychotic. This time, after my first failed attempt at getting through here, Chat and I agreed that we would need to find a map online. And this is the one we found. Look at this goddamn dungeon map. It's not enough that the dungeon layout was made by a fucking masochist, but then the actual map that we find is this ancient thing that makes you feel like a hacker while you decode. But in any case, I eventually sort this thing out and we managed to plot a route. It needs to be efficient though, because this game is a battle of attrition, even more so than the first game. But we do stumble through this wild labyrinth, and Tanis gets his magic sword. Soon after, we find a goblin who gives us information in exchange for his life. Apparently, we can rest nearby with the elderly dragon, Flamestrike. Hell yes! Although she's not quite as grandmotherly as the book version, Flamestrike tells us that Ember is powerful, but he does have one weakness. However, he's absurdly weak against magic missile. After healing, we make our way to the boss arena, and magic missile Ember to death. Damn, sure sucks when your one and only weakness is a level 1 spell that every wizard in every edition takes. Soon enough, we face up against Verminard. This one is a more conventional boss fight, but in true old video game fashion, it's pretty hard to know how well you're doing. I feel like I'm not doing any damage. I feel like I'm not, but he's just gonna suddenly die, probably. Yep, suddenly die. We get some epilogue in which the writers seem to think that the goddess Mishakal is a dude for some reason, and then the party resolves to wander in search of adventure to see if they're ever needed again for any reason, because who needs the established plot anyway? As far as adaptations go, this is one of the worst takes on a D&D property I have ever seen. They use almost nothing other than locations and characters, even when it would have been easy to do so. Like, why didn't Gilthanas and Tanis know each other? Isn't that just, like, better? You would have had to write, like, 1 or 2 more lines of dialogue, and it would have, like, sold a history and an effect. Very strange game, very bad adaptation. And that brings us to game number 3. Game number 3 is a bit different. It takes place in the gap of time between books 1 and 2, in which the heroes guide the refugees to a dwarven city called Thorbarden. The novels just time skip over this, though it is the subject of the 3rd tabletop module. The final scene in book 1 occurs sorta midway through this time period, when the refugees take a break to allow Goldmoon and Riverwind a chance to get married. But otherwise, the original novels do not otherwise cover this time span. Later on in 2006, they did do a throwback novel called Dragons of the Dwarven Depths, where they properly covered this time skip. But I have not read it, so I am not going to give you a big summary. Listen, in the original books it was good enough to say, yeah, then they made it to Thorbarden. So, you know what? That's good enough for me. Thus, let's just get right into the 3rd game. Let me start by saying that 2nd game that we covered, that was already like a bonus title. I hadn't meant to cover the actual Silverbox trilogy. This is even a weird format because it's like only loosely a trilogy anyway. Because this game's kind of separate to the other 2, and then there's also like a 4th game. There's like a bonus RTS that's a little bit disconnected, but it's still set in the Dragonlance universe. In practice, the Silverbox games were 2 side-scrollers, plus a wholly different 3rd game that is a different genre entirely, but still connected narratively. In my wildest dreams, I was not expecting to cover all 3 of these in one video. Thus, you should know, I did not finish this one. Why not? 2 reasons. Number 1, the fact that this video was only supposed to be about the 1st game, but then I got carried away during the streams and kept going. That just made me not feel obligated to see this one through all the way to the end, since we successfully got the gist of it. Number 2, good God, this game is bad in the most frustrating ways imaginable. It's easily the worst of the 3, despite all of the reviews fawning over it for no good reason. So manage your expectations on the review section of this one. There is certainly a correct way to play this, but I certainly didn't find it. I also ended up having Fandrax pop into my chat, who is an amazing YouTuber who has covered these games before, so go check him out. He also checks out old D&D games and also has a tabletop focus like me, and I really do recommend his channel for a different style of review to my own. He's also just a wonderful guy. I'll have to get him on a call for a stream sometime. Anyway, Fandrax tells me that he sunk like 14 hours into this game and just had to tap out, which tells me that this particular horror show is just not worth digging down further into. All that being said, we leave Pax Tharkas with a train of 800 refugees trailing behind us. No longer do we have a preset band of heroes. Instead, we have the entire extended band of heroes, and a few prominent refugees to choose from. Lorana is here, Gilthanas, Elliston, Tika, and others. Party composition is a little bit complicated to put together though, since characters who are romantically involved get penalties if they are not in a party with their lover. You choose 4 characters at a time, but you can swap things around very easily at the refugee camp. There doesn't appear to be an XP system, so you aren't incentivized to keep one party the whole way through or anything. Combat is done largely autonomously, where you assign an action to the character, then they run off and autonomously do the thing. It's simple, it's basic, and it does not work well. The party control screen is also awful. You actually need to swap maps to a party map in order to do things like choose your spells or heal, since you don't actually get a menu for that. Then your characters one by one have to manually leave this little party control screen. Now the refugee caravan. Oh my god, you don't control these guys on your own. Your party's actually independent of the refugees. This game is an escort quest. Now, I know everyone hates how in escort quests you have to babysit some absolute fucking moron as they follow behind you or wander a fixed path. D&D Shadow Sorcerer is brave enough to ask, what if the refugees you were escorting made their own decisions on where they were going? And what if, hear me out, what if they were all fucking stupid? It's a pretty straight shot down to Thorbarden, actually, but every night the refugees have a little conclave to vote on their plan for the day. You can show up and nudge them a little bit to the right direction, but it's quite difficult to understand how to actually convince them of anything. These morons in my playthrough decided to leave the road and get lost in a dark forest that they then refused to leave as they slowly began to starve to death. Then the refugees held a vote and decided, you know what? Let's split up and search for clues. What? No, stupid, stop, don't do that, absolutely not! One refugee caravan decided to remain in place and starve to death, while I got absolutely mobbed by monsters, who literally just spawn camped every single party I tried to make. The other caravan took a vote and decided to return to the mines of Pax Tharkus and become slaves again. This was the worst and most horrible experience. But at least it was fun to experience this awful thing with live viewers as I steadily lost my mind. And that is the Silverbox trilogy. As I said, there is one more Silverbox game, but it's not narratively linked to the others. It's just an RTS where you control the armies during the War of the Lance, rather than continuing the story of the heroes. I am a big RTS fan, so I will probably cover it at some point, but not in this video. Dragonlance and the Silverbox games are very special, but for very different reasons. Dragonlance was unbelievably influential for fantasy fiction. It's also just pretty well written, and I think it holds up incredibly well. Again, check out It's Called a Lance if you want to read along with me. Silverbox games have a different legacy, shall we say, but actually not as negative of one as you might expect. The Silverbox games were called that because they came in a silver box, obviously. But that distinction was important when you compare them to their sister games, the Gold Box series. Both Gold and Silverbox games were made by SSI when they got the D&D video game license in the 1980s. Their heyday was about 4 to 5 years long, and SSI would hold the license another few years after, until eventually losing them to Interplay. The Gold Box games were the true D&D CRPGs of the SSI era. They spammed those things out, and they were very, very well loved. When it was time to move on from the Gold Box engine, SSI still continued on, producing games that carried the legacy of the Gold Box forward. The Dark Sun games, Warriors of the Eternal Sun, and others. Games that took the Gold Box torch and kept running in the same direction. Baldur's Gate came out in 1998. It wasn't SSI making these games anymore, but this was still a clear evolution off of the Gold Box lineage. Kind of a revival of it, in fact, since in the latter half of their time with the license, SSI kind of got lost in the weeds making dungeon crawlers. No shade on those dungeon crawlers, I quite like them, but in any case they are kind of a side note in the history of D&D video games. All the way up to the modern day and the mega hit that was Baldur's Gate 3, you can very easily trace the legacy of the Gold Box games forward through time. These days, just about every D&D video game that comes out is one that inherits the Gold Box legacy. The Gold Box had a clear identity, CRPGs that all used the same engine. The legacy it carried forward was the D&D CRPGs that continued on, though now with new engines and no actual golden boxes. The Silver Box had a different legacy, a muddier legacy. The legacy of D&D video games that were not CRPGs. And that legacy also carried on, just like the Gold Box. And that was despite the Silverbox games being absolute dog shit. Many of the games that inherited the Silverbox legacy were much better than the originals. I'm talking every single D&D RTS game. Games like Dragonstrike, Dark Alliance, and more. It was the understanding that D&D video games could be more things than just CRPGs. And unfortunately, the legacy of the Silverbox games is basically dead at this point. But it shouldn't be. I would love to see Wizards of the Coast be more free with the license. I want Dishonored set in the Underdark. I want more D&D RTS games. I want a Ravenloft survival horror game. I hate the Silverbox games, but I have loved their legacy. Thank you all for listening. This was certainly a long one, huh? Took way longer than anything I've made since Wraith. Lots of pressure to give my childhood favorite the treatment it deserved. Please come visit me on Twitch if you want to hear from me a bit more often. I'm trying to be on there at least once a week if I can help it, so come on and say hi. And if not, I'll see you in the next one, everybody.